Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Alexandra DeSanctis of National Review is in for Jim Garrity today. Happy Columbus Day, everyone. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We'll be talking a little bit about Columbus Day towards the end of our conversation today. Most of our listeners know Alexandra well. If you haven't heard the Ordered Liberty podcast, you know she's subbed for Jim many times in the past. If you're not familiar with her, I can just tell you a few things you need to know. Her name is not Alexandria. She is not related to Florida gubernatorial candidate Ron DeSantis. She loves the New York Yankees. And if you disagree with her and call her DeSanctimonious, she's heard it before. So you don't need to go there. Alexandra, how are you?
Doing great. Good to be with you.
Good to have you with us. Obviously, the big story over the weekend and our good martini today was what happened around 4 o'clock Saturday afternoon Eastern Time. This is Vice President Mike Pence announcing the results of the final confirmation vote on Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh.
On this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
And he was sworn in later on Saturday, so it's Justice Kavanaugh now. When we left you on Friday, we had just heard that Jeff Flake was probably going to vote yes. He did, in fact. Lisa Murkowski voted no, but then voted present so that Steve Daines wouldn't have to hustle back from his daughter's wedding in Montana. The big news Friday afternoon was Susan Collins taking to the Senate floor for over 40 minutes, I believe, to explain why she was, in fact, supporting Judge Kavanaugh, going very methodically through some of the legal arguments against him, and then very much going through the details of the allegations against him. And Alexandra, you took a lot of flack on the right and from elsewhere for saying, hey, let's take a look at these allegations. This might be 11th hour, but it might not necessarily be a house of cards going up against Brett Kavanaugh here. So what's your assessment here? A lot of people see this as a victory for the rule of law, of actually needing, evidence to hold someone responsible for something. Obviously, on the other side, it's a very different story. But from a conservative perspective, it's an important win for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think so, too. This is obviously a huge victory for the conservative movement, for the rule of law, the idea of innocent until proven guilty. This wasn't a criminal trial, obviously, but it had some similarities. And I think it's important for our political system that Kavanaugh got on the court, given the way that everything went down. And I did right at the beginning, when Christine Blasey Ford's allegations first came out, I did write and I said, look, conservatives advocating that we just totally ignore this, or that if Brett Kavanaugh did do what she described, it's okay because it was a long time ago, or, boys will be boys. I think that was a really poisonous argument. I think that is not something I want to see from conservatives. And it's a bad thing that came out after her allegations and that some people went with that argument. But because we took her allegations seriously, and I think that was the right thing to do, we looked into it, and the corroborating witnesses that she named could not back up her account. The FBI investigation that they pushed for did not back up her account. The testimony that she provided was really the only evidence that ever came out that this was something that Kavanaugh had done. And he, of course, vigorously denied it. And the other allegations that sort of trickled out against him as time went on got increasingly ludicrous as Democrats and the media just teamed up against him. And so by the time he was confirmed, to me, I was all in on this nomination, and I was all in on someone who I believe to be, by all accounts, an innocent man.
What do you think the big moments were? A lot of conservatives actually thanking Michael Avenatti for going beyond the pale in the third batch of accusations and basically convincing a lot of people that this was a bunch of baloney.
Yeah, I almost feel bad for Christine Ford at this point, because I think, as I said, her allegations were something that deserved to be taken seriously. And if it's something that Kavanaugh had done, I think that would obviously be disqualifying. And so the fact that, then Deborah Ramirez and the New Yorker published this story about him supposedly at Yale after she spent 6 days reflecting on her memories, things like this, the allegations just slowly got more and more ludicrous. And so something that was really a serious allegation, deserved to be treated seriously, got lumped in with all these other crazy things that were pretty clearly, to me, a smear job against Kavanaugh. And so it became really a political football at that point.
and obviously very intense. We'll talk about that in the crazy martini, some of the backlash towards Susan Collins and others. But let's move to the bad martini now, Alexandra, and let's move to the newest Democratic argument, and that is that the Supreme Court may now be illegitimate, either because of how this process happened or because of the fact that there's now 5 justices that either lean or even more so to the constitutional conservative side. Couple different assessments on this front. First of all, Justice Kagan and Justice Sotomayor were at an event, I believe, on Friday. And here's what Justice Kagan had to say about the Supreme Court perhaps not being seen as legitimate anymore because there might not be a swing vote anymore. Here's what she said.
I think it's been an extremely important thing for the court that in the last really 30 years, starting with Justice O'Connor and continuing with Justice Kennedy, there has been a person who found the center or people couldn't predict in that sort of way, and that's enabled the court to look as though it was not owned by one side or another, and was indeed impartial and neutral and fair. And it's not so clear that, I think going forward, that sort of middle position, it's not so clear whether we'll have it. And that puts, I think, all of us need to be aware of that, every single one of us, and to realize how precious the court's legitimacy is. We don't have an army and we don't have any money, and the only way we get people to do what we say that they should do is because people respect us and respect our fairness.
So the court might not be legitimate anymore, Alexandra, if in fact the results are predictable. She doesn't explain why she couldn't be less predictable by moving more towards the middle. She's essentially labeling herself as a reliable liberal there. And then you got Eric Holder, the former attorney general, who tweeted out, with the confirmation of Kavanaugh and the process which led to it, and then in parentheses, and the treatment of Merrick Garland, the legitimacy of the Supreme Court can justifiably be questioned. The court must now prove through its work that it is worthy of the nation's trust, which from Eric Holder's perspective, I assume means they must agree with him. This is the same attorney general who, when he was asked how long he'd stay in the Obama administration shortly after Obama was reelected, he says, "I'm still enjoying what I'm doing. There's still work to be done. I'm still the president's wingman, so I'm there with my boy." So that's the guy asking for impartiality. So, Alexandra, what do you make of the latest Democratic narrative here?
I mean, you have to wonder, first of all, does Kagan not realize that throughout history, the Supreme Court has been composed of people with judicial philosophies, of all number? There's not always been, 4 on one side of viewing the Constitution and 4 on the other, and then an Anthony Kennedy figure in the middle. That's not how the court has historically operated. And on top of that, I feel like this type of rhetoric sort of lends itself to viewing the court as a super legislature and kind of a, obviously unelected, but a body that's sort of just weighing in with its personal views. And we need the impartial guy in the middle to make sure that it doesn't swing too far liberal or too far conservative. And that's obviously a huge misunderstanding of what the court's actually supposed to be doing. And it clearly is coming from somebody who's now in what she sees as the minority on the court. But if she's so concerned, like you said, why can't she become the swing vote?
Yeah, exactly right. Hey, does this mean if the outcome's predictable that we can just set aside all those rulings from the 60s when the Warren Court was running roughshod over every conservative principle that got brought before the Supreme Court? Because that'd be great.
I wouldn't mind. We could set principle aside for a minute. I could be on board with that.
Let's move to the crazy martini now, Alexandra, because this is a real doozy. The New York Times is very upset with white women. So, Alexandra, you should be ashamed for backing Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. I'm going to read quite extensively from this because it's hard to know what part not to read here. First of all, this is from a PR person named Alexis Granell, an opinion column. After a confirmation process where women all but slit their wrists, letting their stories of sexual trauma run like rivers of blood through the Capitol, the Senate still voted to confirm Judge Brett M. Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. With the exception of Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, all the women in the Republican conference caved, including Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who held out until the bitter end. These women are gender traitors, to borrow a term from the dystopian TV series The Handmaid's Tale. They've made standing by the patriarchy a full-time job. The women who support them show up at the Capitol wearing Women for Kavanaugh t-shirts, but also probably tell their daughters to put on less revealing clothes when they go out. These are the kind of women who think that being falsely accused of rape is almost as bad as being raped. The kind of women who agree with President Trump that, quote, it's a very scary time for young men in America, which he said during a news conference on Tuesday. But the people who scare me the most are the mothers, sisters, and wives of these young men, because my stupid uterus still holds out some insane hope of solidarity. We're talking about white women, the same 53% who put their racial privilege ahead of their second-class gender status in 2016 by voting to uphold a system that values only their whiteness, just as they have for decades. That's because white women benefit from patriarchy by trading on their whiteness to monopolize resources for mutual gain. This blood pact between white women and white men is at issue in the November midterms. President Trump knows it, and at that Tuesday news conference, he signaled to white women to hold the line. Meanwhile, Senator Collins subjected us to a slow funeral dirge about due process and some other nonsense I couldn't even hear through my rage headache as she announced on Friday she would vote to confirm Judge Kavanaugh. Her mostly male colleagues applauded her. The question for white women in November is, which of these two women are you, meaning Collins or Lisa Murkowski? I fear we already know the answer. Alexandra, I can't imagine an op-ed that might get you more fired up than that one.
This is absolutely outrageous. So, of course, my first question is, who on earth at the New York Times read this and thought, you know what, this is exactly the thoughtful, substantive contribution we really need right now in the wake of the Kavanaugh confirmation. This is the commentary that's going to bring us all together and shed some light on what we've just been through. No, this is an absolutely absurd, sexist, racist commentary from somebody who clearly has no idea what our politics is. It's identity politics. It's toxic. The idea that American women either uniformly are opposed to Brett Kavanaugh or they're, opposed to their gender and they're in a blood pact with white men. And that's the only reason they could possibly support due process and the rule of law. It's just so insane. I can't get my mind around it, but it's typical of left-wing feminism. This is something that we've seen, and I'm working on a piece about this right now. The left-wing feminist reaction to Brett Kavanaugh has been 2-1 exactly like this. The idea that any woman who supported Kavanaugh necessarily is betraying all other women there's no legitimate reason in the world they'd be worried about, their fathers, brothers, sons being falsely accused of rape. It's mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. Do you think this resonates with anyone who isn't already in lockstep with someone like this?
I can't imagine that it does. And if you look at, of course, polls only tell you so much, but I think it's clear that American women are not in lockstep on Brett Kavanaugh, not in lockstep on Trump, not in lockstep on, politics at all, Democrat or Republican. There are Republican women, and it's not because they're in some weird blood pact with white men. Okay, there are Republican women who are not white on top of that. And so to argue that all white women are in league against either liberal women or women of color is just absurd and so divisive.
Which side do you think is more cognizant of the Constitution when you see a line like, meanwhile, Senator Collins subjected us to a slow funeral dirge about due process and some other nonsense?
I loved the line about my rage headache. I couldn't hear it through my rage headache. Did you ever think that phrase would appear in the New York Times?
What's the rule about social media about how you're supposed to wait if you're in a really angry mood and because you're probably going to regret it? I don't know. Maybe you can write a whole column without realizing that. So. But obviously the patriarchy, women enabling the patriarchy are a big issue, which leads us perfectly, Alexandra, into this story. Because today, of course, is Columbus Day. And what is it now? 526 years ago, Christopher Columbus landed in the New World. We celebrate that ambition, that discovery, that hard work, that daring enterprise. But of course, he's a white guy, and the indigenous people suffered as a result of that, according to the left. And so we can't possibly celebrate that. But USA Today, the city of Columbus, Ohio, will not observe the controversial federal holiday honoring its namesake, Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, for the first time this year. City offices are instead scheduled to close on Veterans Day in November, through a spokesperson for the mayor's office, and said the decision was not spurred by movements to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. So apparently they said they couldn't give another day off or something like that. So Columbus Day had to not be a holiday in town. What do you make of this?
It's very frustrating to me. As an Italian American, or at least partially Italian, I've always celebrated Columbus Day sort of as a part of my own heritage because he was an Italian guy. And so that's personally, obviously, it's disturbing. But at the same time, no one was perfect. Columbus wasn't perfect. Indigenous people surely were affected. But the idea that we're just going to throw out somebody because there's some parts of his legacy that we don't like. We're going to ignore the fact that he discovered America, obviously, is ridiculous.
Well, Alexandra, have a wonderful Columbus Day, and thanks so much for being with us. As always, we look forward to having you back down the line.
Of course. Thanks, Greg.
Alexandra DeSanctis of National Review, in for Jim Garrity today. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us. Jim will be back on Tuesday. Join us then for the next 3 Martini Lunch.